Change is a constant, and it's feeling like it's a lot more constant-y lately. Okay, it's a word. Now, we can agree there are two types of change. There's the change that we have no control over. Immediate thoughts are COVID, pandemics. And then there's the change that we are asked to lead by our leaders. Maybe it's around an initiative, a program, a new way of working. And to lead change, whether intentional or not, we are asked to spark action, to get the ball rolling to this new world on the other side of that change. Even if we know it won't be welcomed easily or quickly, it still needs to happen. How can we be that person that sparks action leading to change? What does it take? What and who do we need to consider to be successful for ourselves and the organization? I know for myself, I've had varying degrees of success and failure when it comes to driving change. And sometimes I just can't put my finger on why it was either. My guest today has some ideas on all of that, wrote a book about it, and he's going to help us today. Hold on. Welcome back to Relationships at Work, the leadership guide to creating a workplace we love. I'm your host, Russel, a communications and leadership nerd with some decades of experience in both of those areas and a metric ton of curiosity. Yeah, I think that's a proper measurement. A metric ton of curiosity on how we can make the workplace better, a better place for us to work in, around, and through. This podcast is a great place to start. Speaking of starting, I remember talking to a group of staff about their experiences starting in a particular organization, their onboarding experience. And it wasn't great. It was not good. I'm sure you've had similar experiences yourself through your career, or at least heard of them. Whether it was the boss didn't have enough time to talk to you on the first day, second day, the first week. There didn't seem to be much of a process in place for new staff, or nothing seemed to be ready at all on day one, etc., etc., etc. It should never be like this. It never, ever should be like this. This is the first impression employees have of their career at that particular organization. And we need to make it the best. And then, follow up and follow up again and follow up again. Onboarding is just the start of the employee journey. And we need to look at more holistically, not just onboarding, checkbox, see you when you leave. It's a whole journey. And if we look at it as a whole journey, it's a way for our organization and our leaders to truly prove that we actually know how to support our employees. It's what actually inspired me to create a free employee interview template. 3 of them, in fact. One for onboarding, one for stay interviews, or as I like to call them, thrive interviews, because we don't want our employees just to be a bum in a seat and stay. We want them to thrive and grow. Anyway, that interview should be asked over and over again through the journey. And then, of course, the exit interview just to prove you did everything you said you were going to do. It's all tied together to support and inform each other, which is what these interviews should do. So if this sounds like a resource you want, fantastic. Just head over to relationshipsatwork.ca and you'll see a button for this free resource right there at the top. So over to you. Now, let's shift gears from starting a career to starting change in an organization. It's not easy. I've been a change leader for a very long time, and it has varying degrees and complexities to it. And I love what we're going to talk about today, because at first it starts with self-leadership. Are you even the right person to be leading change? And how do you know? And what are the tools you need to be a better change leader? And that's just the internal part of sparking action. What about the external aspects of inspiring that change? Who you're going to inspire, how you're going to inspire. My guest today, Gregg Brown, has written a book to get us going. His work is about getting us change ready and leading change that, actually matters. Whether behind that change or it's change that we had no control over. If anything, over the last few years, we've seen leaders step up and be champions through change. But let's be honest, we've seen leaders falter and show that leadership actually really wasn't their thing. They just liked the title. So they weren't the person to spark that action. And maybe they needed this book. I think myself, I did okay. I did make a few missteps. And I've certainly reflected on the steps that I've taken and tried to figure out where I needed to focus my attention and assessment so I can be better for next time, because there's always a next time. And Gregg Brown, our guest today, has written a book that I think will help me further in that assessment, and I really think it'll help you too. So let's talk to Gregg. And on the show today, we have Gregg Brown, and here is why he is awesome. He is the founder of Change Ready Leadership, a consultancy that provides training, advising, coaching, and thought leadership to small and large organizations. He's a keynote speaker on change leadership. He holds a master's degree of social science with a focus on organizational psychology, leadership, and performance. He's an associate member of the American Psychological Association, and he's the author of a book we're going to dig into today, which is Spark Action: How to Lead Change That Matters. Excited. Hello, Gregg.
Hey, so good to see you today.
You as well, sir. So I'm a big fan of change because I do a lot of change in my own work. And the idea of sparking it and influencing it, interesting, super interesting, especially in this book and the language of it. I don't want to say anything more, Gregg, because I'm ruining things. So before we get into such things, how about I ask the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what's your best or worst employee experience?
Well, I have a ton of worsts, but let me give you a few of the best. I have more of the best. I really learned, I was lucky when I was younger. I learned in my 20s that I really thrive in an environment where I'm allowed to be as entrepreneurial as I can. And I worked in a nonprofit at that point. And what was so great was I was really allowed to work in my skills and was allowed to, be entrepreneurial in terms of, run an area with someone else and really focus and do the work that I wanted to do. And I had to obviously stay within the guidelines of the organization, but it really set the stage for me to learn that when we work, in our natural abilities and we're allowed to really build those strengths and continue down that groove, that's where I thrive. I didn't thrive, and I knew by that point, and I'd learned later, I didn't thrive in environments that were cubicles where I sat all day. I'm, raging extrovert. I need to get out. I need to be able to, do the work I need to do. And I was so lucky to have a boss and an organization that allowed me to do that. And I stayed with them for a very long time in various capacities as a result.
So I have a question about that as an intrapreneur. Did
Yeah.
you look for that in an organization, or did your boss notice that in you and just give you more and more freedom?
I think I'd sort of gone around from job to job, probably had 10 jobs at the time I was 26, because I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I think it was a combination of things where I was hired into a role. I really thrived in it. And then another role came up and they took a chance on me. So I think they really gave me that opportunity. And yet once I had it, I think as long as I could demonstrate that I was continuing to contribute in a way that was meaningful and do the goals and objectives of my department, I was that entrepreneur at that time. And so I think it was a combination. I had to advocate for it, and they were able to give me the space for it as well. And I had a really good boss who, of course, we all know what the research says around that, we tend to, if we're unhappy, we tend to leave because of our bosses. I don't believe that that's true 100% of the time. But, for me, people have always been really important who I report to. So that's not true for everyone, but for me, it is.
Let's get into this new book. Sparking change is interesting. So most books that I've read on change management is all about navigating change, especially nowadays where change seems to be happening every 15 minutes. Since COVID happened, it's like we are constantly in a flux. But you took a different stance on this, which is very much the influence of change, which is leading change. So I guess the first question I have to ask is, why would someone need to spark change? Like, why would they need to pick up a book like this? Because not everybody might see themselves in that role.
Well, I believe that all of us on the planet and all of us in organizations, we're required to influence and lead others to get things done. So, in an organization, whether you're a frontline admin professional, a receptionist, an IT person, a project manager, a leader, a policy analyst, whatever your role, we have to engage others in our ideas so they can take action. And I think, all of us are required to do that. And then, also outside of work, whether it's, people doing things on the side, if they're entrepreneurs and whatever that may be, or they have hobbies that they want to sell something, at a farmer's market, I hear that a lot. It's not about trying to sell and convince people. And I think, we put our pressure on ourselves that our job is to sell and convince, especially in organizations. And I really talk in the book about, take that pressure off. It's not about having to sell and convince. And good salespeople know that selling is not a one-way didactic, throwing out the benefits to everybody and everybody's going to buy your product. So I think it's relevant, whether you're an entrepreneur, sales rep, or someone in an organization, whatever level, that all of us are required to engage other people in our ideas so they can take action. All of us. I don't know anybody that works in a silo anymore, or ever did anyway.
What are we doing wrong when it comes to change leadership? Because obviously you wrote the book for a reason to fix a problem. So what were you seeing out there that you're like, oh, I need a book on this?
Well, I think, one of the things that I've really found from my experience, in the research that I've done, is that there's so much change going on that we're reacting to, especially with COVID. We were running on a treadmill constantly trying to keep up. And then, about a year ago, we started to have to start thinking strategically again, whether COVID was here or not. We had to start thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How are we going to, and it didn't matter if you were government or private sector or association, wherever, that we had to think about, okay, we have to start planning for the future. We have to start doing this. We have to start doing that. And I think, a few pieces came out of that I put into the book. One was, if we influence and lead change well, it builds people's resilience. It builds their capability to handle change. And I think that that's a key intersection in the book about those two pieces, is that navigating the future, navigating change and resilience is also built upon how I influence and lead change for you or for someone else or for my team. So I think there was that piece that I wanted to highlight. And, the other piece that, I've heard from leaders over the years, and I did hundreds of virtual sessions through COVID. And then, of course, before that, I've done hundreds and hundreds of workshops and keynote speeches and stuff with audiences. And, people use this word sell and convince constantly. It doesn't matter where they work or what role they're in, whether the CEO in a private sector organization or, a chief administrative officer in a public sector, right on down. I got to get people to buy in. I've got to sell people on this. I got to get people to do this. And I really felt that is the big sort of pain point that we all tend to feel. And I really wanted to write a book that was about, how do we engage others in our ideas so that they can actually take action? And it's not about selling and convincing. It's about remembering that change happens in the mind of the other person. The buy-in happens in the mind of the other person. The agreement to do something happens in the mind of the other person. So what do they need to be, do, know, or have to say yes? And that's sort of been the holistic view I took with the book.
How do you know you're the right person for change leadership? Because I've been in organizations, I've seen organizations where they have this person is leading change. I'm like, oh, that is the last person I'm listening to. Like, it's not as much about the message as about the messenger. So how do you know?
Yeah, you know what? That is such a great point, because I believe that, I can teach anybody to do a change management plan or a project plan or a strategic plan, budgets, frameworks. Those are the easy things to teach. And yet, how we are able to lead our teams, and by lead our teams, I mean, again, the frontline admin professional who has to do an event, the the person who's a project manager is to influence others, who has no authority. And most of us have no authority in an organization. We still have to lead and influence. And it's really about, what are those interpersonal power skills that I bring to the table as a leader? And I think, it's about figuring out what is our character around this, and what are the things that ticks us off? How do we build trust in the process? I believe those are the couple of pieces that make or break our success as a change leader, because our character development and our abilities to lead people regardless of our job title, that's what makes or breaks our success in any role. I believe in any role.
You start the book off talking about having a PhD for yourself, which I love. If anybody listens to the podcast, I'm a self-awareness nerd. Like, I
Yeah,
absolutely think that is the strongest superpower any leader can have.
for
The
sure. And
interesting
that's self leadership. That's, any leadership role, whether it's change leadership or strategically, whatever leader role, it starts with self leadership and getting a PhD in yourself. You need to know, just like you say, what ticks you off, what makes you happy, what you're good at, what you're not good at.
whether you are the person to be pushing this particular type of change or not, or you're a better face for something else. But what I found really interesting is that you took half the book to focus. I mean, even though the first chapter is PhD, you don't even mention external change influence until about halfway through the book. So, what is that tipping point of I think I'm ready as an individual. I know myself well enough. I know the situation and how I would react in these situations to get to that influence level of pushing on the ecosystem. So, what is that tipping point?
Well, I think there's a few things there. The first part of the book is about getting a PhD in yourself. And it's about understanding other people and how they respond to change, and how, even, people I work with for years said, oh, I love change. I'm really good at change. I'm really change ready. And, no one on the planet is ready for a change that has a negative impact on them. You have a very different response. If I say to you, hey, you're leaving your job, you're not working here anymore, you have a very different response to if you choose to leave the job on your own. So it's, where does that, and most of us at work, most change is disruptive. It's imposed upon us. It comes from above. It's legislative. It's regulatory. It's driven by, someone's vision inside the organization that may be higher up than us. And I think the piece is about, when we're influencing change, is knowing how to frame things, knowing how to say things, knowing how to structure things in a way that keeps people engaged. Because, as you mentioned at the beginning, we don't have more time. We're running faster. Change is happening faster than every even 15 minutes. Sometimes change is happening on a minute by minute basis,
Mhm.
depending what's going on and where you sit. And our only way to really keep up and to dive into these waves of change, and to, tread water in the waves of change, is to, be more efficient in how we communicate and how we help people and how we structure our ideas, and in how we want to lead people down that path.
Is there a bridge too far when it comes to naysayers? Because as much as we talk to the early adopters and those tipping point people, there will always be naysayers. And I love that you talk in the book about embracing the negative, under using it as learning moments. But can we get too far and go, you know what? I'm not going to waste any more of my energy on those.
I would often think, if I was looking at, say, 100% of my time, and where I'm going to focus, I might spend 10% at the begin, somewhere with those. And I want to hear the people that are the naysayers. I want to hear what's going on for them. I might not be able to problem solve that. I talk a lot in the book about not having to solve people's problems, but listening and acknowledging can move people down that path of change as much as problem solving. And if they still don't, I'm just going to ignore them at some point. Now, if they report into me, we're not going to have an influence discussion. We might have a more authoritative discussion where I put my authority hat on and say, I need you to get on this. But that would only happen after we'd had some other dialogues. But I will not focus all my energy on them. It'd be like if I was doing a keynote and, I can see two people, which would be rare because I'm joking, but let's say there's two people out of 1,000 not interested in what I'm saying. And guess what? There will be. And if I spent all my energy on those 2 or 3 people trying to convert them, I'd be ignoring the other 998 people that are interested. I mean, the ratio may be a bit lower than that, maybe 10 people out of 1,000, but I'm kidding.
But that's the thing. We focus on the negative, not the trend. We
For
spend way
sure. And yeah, and I think we want to follow, we always, as people that are leading change, again, leadership is not about a job title. I believe every single one of the people listening here is a leader, regardless of your job title. I've worked with, frontline admin receptionists and admin professionals who can rope people in to do anything. And I've worked with senior leaders who can't get anybody to do a darn thing. So it's not about the job title. But what it is about the mindset that we have to get people involved and engaged. And that is, switching from that sales mindset to what I call an educator mindset. It's a two-way process, and good salespeople know that, and good leaders know that, good policy analysts, good project managers, whatever your job title. We know that we have to figure out what do they need to know to say yes.
Well, it goes back to also the communications 101 idea that everything's two-way. It's not only what you say, but how it's received. And you have to know your audience to know that. Now, speaking of that, you talk about innovation and taking risk and thinking differently, but there are so many organizations who have culture that do not and are not interested in change. So what do you bring as a sparking change, sparking action to an organization that is risk adverse?
So I think when, I work with organizations that might be more risk averse, what I like to do is do some scenario planning with them and go, okay, so if this happens, what is this? If this happens, what could happen here? And I also think it's about grading risks, asking what's the likelihood of this happening? Low, medium, high. If it does happen, what's the impact? Because, we can't run around putting out every fire, and not everything's going to be as bad as we think it is. And I think, if people, when we talk about risk management, immediately jump into here's my contingency plan, here's what I'm going to do, or we're just not going to do it. And I like to look at what are the causes of something happening and how can we prevent these from happening? Because if we can put a plan in place, and we do risk management all the time as human beings, we wear seatbelts in the car, when we look at both ways, when we cross the street, when we get to the airport 3 hours early, that's all risk management. So we do it. And I think, I'm not saying for organizations to be, jumping off cliffs all the time, but if you don't embrace innovation, and risk management's tied into innovation because you have to manage that stuff as you go through the process. If you don't embrace it, I think you'll become obsolete.
What is the role, and you do touch on it a little bit near the end of the book, which is psychological safety. So it's not only knowing yourself, it's knowing and building trust externally to build change. So how is psychological safety such a big part of sparking action?
Well, I think let's just define psychological safety first. So
Please.
psychological safety to me doesn't mean, let's hold hands and sing and hug each other and all that stuff. That's not what we're referring to in this context. Psychological safety really means, do I have engagement? Do I have commitment? Do I have trust with my employees and colleagues and coworkers? And do I feel safe? Sometimes I find that word hard to use at work because it just means so many different things to different people. But I really like, does it feel okay for me to bring up my ideas? Am I going to be shamed for them? Am I going to be told I'm silly? Am I, what is that? And one of the things we know is that all of us, people will blame their managers all the time. And yet what I really believe, someone once asked me this at a keynote, and they tried to, get me on this. It's like, well, what do we do if the managers don't create the culture change? And I'm like, every single one of us that shows up at work every day has an opportunity to create the culture. It's not about the job title. Yes, there's power and authority here that will trickle down and show what's safe for us and politically okay for us to do. Because of course there's politics in any organization around what's okay, what's not okay, those, cultural beliefs that are intangible. And yet, I think how we show up and how we model behavior, whatever our role, is what's integral to that piece around that. And when we're in meetings, how are we, if it says we respect everybody and blah, blah, blah on the wall, and then, the culture in the organization is everybody just shows up 15 minutes late. What we know from the research is that if your meetings run over time, then your projects will run over time, your initiatives will run over time, your budgets will run over. because there's no concept of managing time properly. So those are those cultural elements that impact innovation, risk, and that psychological safety of, can I bring up this idea and not be shut down?
Not to oversimplify it, but from the research and from your book, which, like I said, spoke very much internal, and then it gets a little more external,
Mhm.
what do you feel is the greatest catalyst for change? Is it the communication? Is it just knowing yourself well enough?
I think the greatest catalyst for change will be our mindset shift. And I said this at the beginning. We have to get out of the mindset that we have to sell and convince people. Like, stop that. It's about weighing what are the benefits and what is the impact. Because when we don't talk about the impact of, this is the benefits to our customer or to our clients, and it's going to create an extra 20 hours of work for us. We don't weigh it out like that. We look insincere. We look out of touch with reality. We look like that we're not, what I said with that educator mindset, having a two-way dialogue, just by throwing benefits at the wall, like throwing spaghetti on the wall, hoping something sticks. Like, no. And I would say that for me is real catalyst, because I think everything, and I talk about this in my keynotes a lot, everything starts with our mindset. And mindset's not a woo-woo term out there. It's a collection of neurons in your prefrontal cortex that just determines how you're going to problem solve and decision make throughout the day. So we have a choice. How am I going to engage with people? I believe that's the key. And I know it's the key, because at home I forget to do that. And then I get into trouble.
I love that you bring that up too, because a lot of people look at, building trust at work. How do you do that? I'm like, do you have friends? Do you have family? There is the exact same muscles. You can look
Yeah.
at any psychological book about trust, and they are easily the exact same damn thing. But at the same time, people think it's a different world as soon as they cross that threshold.
Charles Feldman's done some great research on trust, and he's broken it down to 4 areas, which are, do you do what you say you're going to do?
Mm.
Do you mean what you say? Do you care about what I have to say? And are you capable to do the work that you say you're going to do? And because competence is knowing what you're good at and knowing what you're not good at. And I love his 4 levels of trust, because you can just go, well, I trust you when I'm trying to work with people. I trust them for this, but I don't trust them for this. So how can we build up that aspect of trust? Because trust is, I find, easier to get, and then once it's broken, good luck getting it back.
As you're progressing through the book and leaning into learning the environment in which you're getting into, are there any red flags that you should really be looking for? Your book does a great job at laying out what to say, what really not to
Yeah.
say, and understanding your environment. But are there some canaries in a coal mine that maybe you should be looking for, that this might not be the right time for change?
Well, I think a few things about that. So I love that you mentioned the timing for change. I don't think we have a lot of control over that most of the time. Like, even CEOs in a large 50,000 person organization, sometimes, change is driven externally or by stakeholders or by board members. Or so I don't know if we have a lot of control over the timing, because I get asked that a lot. And I don't think we have a lot of control over the timing for most of us. Now, when it comes to granular time, like the example I gave you about the head person telling employee reorganization on a Friday afternoon, that timing is a red flag for me. I'm like, you don't know, or you weren't thinking about when to do this. Could have waited till Monday, or it could have been done the Monday before, or it doesn't need to usually happen on a Friday at 3 o'clock. So those sorts of individual control over timing, I would say, if you have control over that, be smart about it. And, if you got into the head of the other person and thought about, well, how are they going to react to this? You'd probably figure out Friday in the afternoon's not the best time to do that. So I think, other red flags are things like, and again, I don't think you have control over this, but it's things you need to build into what's going on. in terms if you're having high staff turnover, obviously, if you're having, people feeling completely overwhelmed with change, which so many people are today, that's a red flag that I might not be able to control the time, but we might need to have some conversations about this so you don't think I'm just out of touch with reality. Because then we can build trust if I show you that I'm not out of touch with reality. I also think, another red flag is, this is one of my biggest, I think I talk about this in the book somewhere, where people say, oh, it's going to be all right. Everything's going to be fine. So if someone says that to me, my alarm bells start going off. I'm like, they probably haven't done any risk management around this and anticipated what could go wrong and planned for it. So those would be my top three.
You mentioned in the book a few times that you're a raging extrovert. So
Correct.
I want to ask the question for the raging introverts out there.
Yeah.
How did they handle a book like this that is giving them a roadmap, but they may not be so prepared, whether it's a neurodivergency mindset, whether introvert, as I said.
Yeah.
How do they navigate?
Well, so this is the thing, right? Like, and it's more, I think, as you know, more than extroversion and introversion. And the book isn't for raging extroverts. The big chunk of the book is all about understanding who you are, how you like to receive information, how you like to send it, blah, blah, blah. And so it is about knowing yourself. And one of the things we know is some of the best leaders, some of the best speakers are raging introverts. You don't need to be a raging extrovert to be a great speaker, so it doesn't matter about that. I think it's about knowing where you sit, where you reside, what are your strengths, what do you need to improve upon, and being able to dial up and dial down those strengths as you go throughout the process of developing change or leading it or initiating it or talking about it. So, yeah, I believe our personalities impact how we talk, how we communicate, how we plan, how we think. I believe if you have a depth of knowledge of that, as you mentioned earlier, that we're able to dial up, dial down. We're able to, you know, figure out, how do I need to say this so the other person can hear it? What's of value to them versus what's my role? We want to get into the head of our target audience or our change targets and go, what does this group need to know to get on board with this? What does this group need to get it? What is this? And it might be different. And you got to take the time to plan that out.
One of the best and most effective tools that you highlight in the book, which I am a huge fan of, is storytelling. It is really understanding the story you're not only telling yourself, but also the one you're trying to tell the organization and those you're trying to
Yeah.
make change of. But
Yes.
you'll still get that same person standing in front of a PowerPoint presentation with 37 million words at 9 font, right? They're just reading back. So what does a great presented story, as an example, look like to spark change?
So, a few things. I don't talk in the book about, how to do presentations in terms of, using PowerPoint and stuff. That's not, I don't delve into, there's plenty of books on that sort of stuff, as you just mentioned. Um, I really think, the storytelling and change, and we have to create stories. And by stories, it means, I don't mean making up or making up, fairy tales or, writing a book, but creating a story around the change of, how am I going to make this relatable to the people I'm trying to engage in this idea? And it might look different for people. And I think a story needs to, include things, how am I going to bridge in my ideas, build the bridge so other people can hear me and why they should listen to me. And that's more than just the rationale. It's, figuring out, what do they need to hear to start engaging in this? What are my intentions of the session? How am I going to get them thinking about it? And also, being able to have a few different versions of this story. And by story, again, I'm not meaning a novel. I'm meaning like a structured way to communicate the change. You might need to have a 1-minute version of it, a 5-minute version, a 15-minute version, depending where you go, because the stories that we tell in organizations create the culture. And, we want to be clear what those are. So I do give a framework on that. And then after that, I really, also talking about, what do we have to do when we speak on tricky topics and when we have to engage others in topics that, might create job loss or make at least fear of job loss. Well, it might not create job loss, but everybody starts to fear that stuff normally because it hits at our core of, can I pay my rent? Can I pay my mortgage? Can I put my kids through school? Whatever people's issues are. And anything that hits core like that, we have to be prepared for, and the story's going to look a little different.
Can you share a story, whether it's big or small, on a level of change? You've sort of followed this path and it tipped the needle in the direction they were trying to go?
Yeah, one of the ones, I'll tell a story that's in the book that I used to do workshops in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which was the poorest postal code in Canada, still one of the poorest postal codes. And I was working with a group of Catholic sisters who wanted to do so. They just started working with people living on the street. And one of the things about these sisters, these nuns, they weren't trying to convert anybody to their religion or anything like that. They were just what I call the Sound of Music nuns. So if anybody knows the Sound of Music, the type of nuns just want to do good on the planet. And these women, I was teaching them about drug use, sexual health, a whole bunch of stuff. And these women, had a lot of cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, and we were doing a bit of a workshop together where they had to learn some street terms, some different language that people used on the street, so they wouldn't be shocked when street involved people came up and started talking about various body parts and things that were going on. So we had a picture, we're in a room, 25 women, there's 25 flip charts on the wall with clinical names at the top of flip charts between your body parts and between your neck and your knees, those types of ones, and all the practices that go with those. And I asked them to write down all the street terms that they'd heard. And initially they were hesitant, so I took a step out and wrote down something innocuous. And then eventually they all stepped out and started laughing. And soon enough, 25 pieces of paper were filled with words, some of them I'd never heard of, dirty words, these words, however you want to label them. And we took a step back and analyzed them and so on, and looked at the differences in men's and women's and all that stuff. And, what really stood out for me was they were willing to step through their own belief systems, their religious beliefs, their cultural beliefs, their backgrounds, all that stuff we all bring to work, because that's the similarity. We all bring this stuff to work too. Our backgrounds, what we believe is right or wrong, good or bad. But in their situation, it was extreme, right? Because they're going from being very, what I would say very religious beliefs to having to learn this sort of stuff. And as a result of them going through this change process, and that was a change process that we did on the second day, don't do it on the first day because we had to build trust first, as you mentioned. They were able to serve a whole new population of people in a way that was non-judgmental, that was in a way that was really helpful and good. And I think they're still in the downtown east side doing that work. And how that relates to us in the workplace is that if those sisters can break through their own self-imposed limitations to learn something new so they can serve a whole new group of people, when we take that to the workplace, what can we do? Because if they can do it, we can do that stuff too. Like we're talking about at work, we're not talking about that stuff on flip chart papers like I was. We're talking about changes and workplace change, or even if it's in our personal life, starting businesses and volunteering or whatever our work is, or what we want to do to create change that matters on the planet. Our self-imposed limitations are our greatest barrier to change. And, one of the things I learned with COVID is that if we can do that for 3 years, what can we do? We are all way more change ready than we think we are, all of us. And I use that example from those nuns 30 years ago, but anybody that's listening to this podcast, if I said to them, what is a new quality skill or practice that you built over the last 3 years? People could identify a bunch of different things they learned to do. And I don't mean learning how to do Zoom, but like other types of things. How they handled the changes, how they rolled with the punches of COVID. All of those muscles that we built, change muscles, will serve us going forward. And we're way more change ready than we think we are, especially after having gone through COVID. What can we do? And we have to do it in a way that also manages our mental health, manages our resilience, and allows us to respond to that rapid pace of change.
So, Gregg, I got to ask you the question I ask all of my guests, which is, What's
Yeah.
one simple action people can do right now to improve those relationships at work?
I think the biggest thing people can do is to, before they start to try to talk to people about change or talk to their boss or go to other people about something, is to really get into their head and go, what do they need to be, do, nor have to say yes? And it's hard to pause. I would go in to my boss going, hey, I really want to go to this conference. I really want to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And he'd say to me, Greg, stop just for a sec. Take a step back. What do I need to know about this to say yes? Then go back to my office. Who's gonna cover your time? How's it gonna get paid for? What are the optics? Really start to ask those questions. So I think if you take 2 minutes in the hallway before you go talk to someone to try to get them to do something or to try to sign something or to take your idea forward or to lead whatever it is to stop just for, what do they need to be, do, nor have? Because remember, the change happens in the mind of the other person. If you remember that principle, that's that one thing. I believe if you get that, everything will unfold from there.
That is Gregg Brown. He is the founder of the consultancy Change Ready Leadership. And I could not recommend his book enough. If you're a leader, if you're a communications nerd, and if you're a mindset nerd, highly recommend Spark Action, How to Lead Change That Matters. Thanks so much for being here, Greg.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that'll do it for another episode of Relationships at Work, the leadership guide to creating a workplace we love. I'm Russel Lolliker. Thank you so much for being a fan of employee experience, a fan of improving the workplace culture. You wouldn't have listened to this podcast if you weren't. So if you have a moment and you know somebody that also is a fan of doing something better than they've seen before, maybe navigating a new path or just doing better than how they were shown, share the podcast with them. Whether it's an email, a text message, or even just in conversation, mention Relationships at Work and for them to check it out. I'm working to help the podcast grow, and it would really help me out if you do. Thank you so much. Take care.